Right, the 10th ikar, the belief in God's omniscience and providence. So, firstly, do we choose if God knows?
So, this is a well-known question, right? HaRambam is very strong in Hilchot Shuvah Perikeh about the belief in free will. Unencumbered free will. Nothing inhibits our free will. He talks about those Jews who believe in astrological influences, and he calls them fools. He says God himself doesn't intervene in stopping our free will. And he asks us another question before the question you're referring to, is to that if we're operating against God's, what he desires and what he wants, isn't that a certain sense, how could we go against God? And he says that is the will of God, because he created a world where man has free will. So the first point is that we have free will. Now, your next question is, if God knows what I'm going to do before I do it, or potentially before I was even born, then does that inhibit, limit, or destroy my free will? So this is HaRambam's question in Hilchot Shuvah. And HaRambam discusses and distinguishes between the knowledge of man and the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God, the knowledge of man actually is attaining something. It is external to man. Man is something, his knowledge is something, he learns about something, and then he adds that to his repertoire of knowledge. That is attained knowledge external to him. God's knowledge, God's essence, and his knowledge are one. That means that knowledge is not attained. That there is no there's no change in God, so there's no attaining knowledge. It's part and one of his essence. And just as we don't understand his essence, we don't understand in general the aspects of his knowledge. The Rabbi comes a harsh critique, and he says, no, you start a question and you didn't finish it, right? You said we should have just left it alone, because you said, oh, what's the question? So we can't understand his knowledge. But I think HaRambam, coupled with what he elaborates also in the Moreh Nebuchim, I think it is answering the question in saying the qualitative difference of God's knowledge doesn't imply, certainly doesn't imply that it is relegated to concepts of within the Bria of time, right? That only is within God's Bria. Outside of the Bria is God's total and complete knowledge. And so therefore there's a difference between those two concepts. And the fact that there is no relegation of time to that shows that it is qualitatively different than knowing what I will do. The Ravad himself gives a different answer, and there are multiple answers that many of our great Jewish thinkers give to this question. It's a well-known question. But what we do know and what we do accept is that free will exists and God's omniscience exists. God knows all of our plans, Yodea Machshevot Bnei Adam, all of our thoughts.
Right. I think the best way I understood this was I was once on a trip with Adam Harari. We were in Switzerland together. We walked into the Albert Einstein Museum, and they were explaining just within the theory of relativity, because if you have a train that's just zipping by at 60 miles an hour, and then you have another one that's walking side by side that's traveling at 20, relative to where you are on that train, the second one is only traveling 40 miles an hour, right? So everything relative needs to be relative to something physical, right? Time always needs to be bound and relative to something physical. And the second you eliminate physicality from God, there's no such thing as time. There's no before, or after. And almost you can't even speak to knowledge anymore, because knowledge, the way we think of it, is always, bound and relegated by time.
Excellent point. I mean, that's really what we're saying. And a lot of the relativity of what Einstein says really helps us understand so much about Torah.
Right. So on the free will point, how can we legitimately say that we have free will if we know that humans are born with a certain nature unique to who they are?
HaRambam in Hilchot Deot discusses that. And he talks about the personality traits. That some, yes, we're born with certain traits. And some traits we have a propensity towards them. And some are learned. By the way, that also could limit. Just because we learned them when they're young, that could also be a limitation of the free will. Not only genetics. But nevertheless, over there, HaRambam is dafka over there. He's very clear that with whatever we're born with and whatever we're given, it is totally within our ability to perfect, work, and change ourselves when needed. And that's really where free will comes. We may have a propensity to anger, but there's a way to fix that. And in fact, that's the point of our existence, to perfect an imperfect creation. That's what we are. And to create and live our lives in perfecting those imperfections. That's the essence of our purpose. And that's the way HaRambam understands it. And certainly we have the ability to do that. Sometimes it's very difficult, but that's what we're here to do.
Right. So this principle itself is rooted in a once widespread belief in free will. Now, today, sciences have grown steadily bolder in their claim that all human behavior can be explained through the clockwork laws of cause and effect. So, not proven, but how do these scientific discussions affect our understanding of this principle and where it goes?
I think you're talking about some of the classic argument of the physicists in which they believed in a clear cause and effect deterministic society. And it is true they believed in that. And it is true many of them have turned against free will and have told us that we only think we're having free will. We have the illusion of free will, but it's not. That exists. I don't believe that that discussion or that belief coincides with Torah whatsoever. Fortunately, they have yet to enter the area of consciousness, and they have yet to prove their point, so much so that in the quantum world of physics, where that perfect structure is disrupted and exists a random universe in the mind of the quantum physicist, and disputing many of those experiments that you might have been referring to. One such would have been studies of the neurological functions of the brain, where those neurological reactions and to a situation come before the choice and the decision. So therefore, those experiments would prove it. But as I mentioned, many of those experiments have been debunked and certainly questioned, certainly by the new areas of quantum physics, and as well as the study of consciousness and conscious behavior, where science is not able to really penetrate the idea of consciousness. I remember Gerald Schroeder once lectured on that, and his belief is that they have not anywhere come near to proving their attack on free will.
But if they did, we'd be in trouble.
We'd be in trouble. I'm not so worried, because HaRambam would believe that free will, there are so much concepts of the Torah dependent on it. The next Ikad we'll talk about is Sachar B'Onesh, that's totally dependent on free will, the belief of reward and punishment. So many areas of Torah are impacted by our belief in free will. So it's a crucial component, and the lack of belief in free will doesn't seem to fit with our Torah, certainly not the way HaRambam understood it.